Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to introduce our guest this evening. Carmen Maria Machado is a fiction writer, critic, and essayist whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, Tin House, Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. Her debut short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties, was longlisted for the National Book Award and is a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Novelist Karen Russell writes that in these formally brilliant and emotionally charged tales, Machado gives literal shape to women's memories and hunger and desire. She is currently the artist in residence at the University of Pennsylvania. Her memoir, House in Indiana, is forthcoming next year. Jennifer Egan won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for the novel A Visit from the Goon Squad. Her other books of fiction include the National Book Award finalist Look at Me, the bestselling The Keep, and The Invisible Circus, which was adapted into a film. Her new book, Manhattan Beach, also longlisted for the National Book Award, is a historical novel about the transformative moments before and after the Great Depression. In a New York Times review of the book, Dwight Garner writes that she works a formidable kind of magic, with a big novel that moves with agility, blissfully free of rust and sepia tint. Please first welcome Carmen Maria Machado to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Oh my God, it's so good to see you all. Hi. I made a book. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I am going to be reading from the first story in Her Body and Other Parties, which is titled The Husband's Stitch. I'm not going to be finishing it, so if you want to know what happens, there's a book for sale upstairs. The Husband's Stitch. If you read this story out loud, please use the following voices. Me, as a child, high-pitched, forgettable. As a woman, the same. The boy who will grow into a man and be my spouse, robust with serendipity. My father, kind, booming, like your father, or the man you wish was your father. My son, as a small child, gentle, sounding with the faintest of lisps, as a man like my husband, all other women interchangeable with my own. In the beginning, I know I want him before he does. This isn't how things are done, but this is how I am going to do them. I am at a neighbor's party with my parents, and I am 17. I drink half a glass of white wine in the kitchen with the neighbor's teenage daughter. My father doesn't notice. Everything is soft, like a fresh oil painting. The boy is not facing me. I see the muscles of his neck and upper back, how he fairly strains out of his button-down shirts like a day laborer dressed up for a dance, and I run slick. And it isn't that I don't have choices. I am beautiful. I have a pretty mouth. I have breasts that heave out of my dresses in a way that seems innocent and perverse all at the same time. I'm a good girl from a good family, but he is a little craggy in that way men sometimes are, and I want. He seems like he could want the same thing. I once heard a story about a girl who requested something so vile from her paramour that he told her family and they had her hauled off to a sanitarium. I don't know what deviant pleasure she asked for, though I desperately wish I did. What magical thing could you want so badly they take you away from the known world for wanting it? The boy notices me. He seems sweet, flustered. He says hello. He asks my name. I have always wanted to choose my moment, and this is the moment I choose. On the deck, I kiss him. He kisses me back, gently at first, but then harder, and even pushes open my mouth a little with his tongue, which surprises me, and I think perhaps him as well. I have imagined a lot of things in the dark, in my bed, beneath the weight of that old quilt, but never this, and I moan. When he pulls away, he seems startled. His eyes dart around for a moment before settling on my throat. What's that? He asks. Oh, this? I touch my ribbon at the back of my neck. It's just my ribbon. I run my fingers halfway around its green and glossy length and bring them to a rest on the tight bow that sits in the front. He reaches out his hand, and I seize it and press it away. You shouldn't touch it, I say. You can't touch it. Before we go inside, he asks me if he can see me again. I tell him that I would like that. That night before I sleep, I imagine him again, his tongue pushing open my mouth, and my fingers slide over myself, and I imagine him there, all muscle and desire to please, and I know we are going to marry. We do. I mean, we will. But first, he takes me in his car, in the dark, to a lake with a marshy edge that is hard to get close to. He kisses me and clasps his hand around my breast, my nipple nodding beneath his fingers. I am not truly sure what he is going to do before he does it. He is hard and hot and dry and smells like bread, and when he breaks me, I scream and cling to him like I am lost at sea. His body locks onto mine, and he is pushing, and before the end, he pulls himself out and finishes with my blood slicking him down. I am fascinated and aroused by the rhythm, the concrete sense of his need, the clarity of his release. Afterwards, he slumps in the seat, and I can hear the sounds of the pond, loons and crickets, and something that sounds like a banjo being plucked. The wind picks up off the water and cools my body down. I don't know what to do now. I can feel my heart beating between my legs. It hurts, but I imagine it could feel good. I run my hand over myself and feel strains of pleasure from somewhere far off. His breathing becomes quieter, and I realize that he is watching me. My skin is glowing beneath the moonlight coming through the window. When I see him looking, I know I can seize that pleasure like my fingertips tickling the very end of a balloon string that has almost drifted out of reach. I pull and moan and ride up the crest of sensation slowly and evenly, biting my tongue all the while. I need more, he says, but he does not rise to do anything. He looks out the window, and so do I. Anything could move out there in the darkness, I think. A hook-handed man, a ghostly hitchhiker forever repeating the same journey, an old woman summoned from the repose of her mirror by the chants of children. Everyone knows these stories. That is, everyone tells them, even if they don't know them, but no one ever believes them. His eyes drift over the water and then return to me. Tell me about your ribbon, he says. There's nothing to tell. It's my ribbon. May I touch it? No. I want to touch it, he says. His fingers twitch a little, and I close my legs and sit up straighter. No. Something in the lake muscles and writhes out of the water and then lands with a splash. He turns at the sound. A fish, he says. Sometime, I tell him, I will tell you the stories about this lake and her creatures. He smiles at me and rubs his jaw. A little of my blood smears across his skin, but he doesn't notice, and I don't say anything. I would like that very much, he says. Take me home, I tell him, and like a gentleman, he does. That night, I wash myself. The silky suds between my legs are the color and scent of rust, but I am newer than I have ever been. My parents are very fond of him. He is a nice boy, they say. He will be a good man. They ask about his occupation, his hobbies, his family. He shakes my father's hand firmly and tells my mother flatteries that make her squeal and blush like a girl. He comes around twice a week, sometimes thrice. My mother invites him in for supper, and while we eat, I dig my nails into the meat of his leg. After the ice cream puddles in the bowl, I tell my parents that I'm going to walk with him down the lane. We strike off through the night, holding hands sweetly until we are out of sight of the house. I pull him through the trees, and when we find a patch of clear ground, I shimmy off my pantyhose and on my hands and knees offer myself up to him. I have heard all the stories about girls like me, and I am unafraid to make more of them. I hear the metallic buckle of his pants and the shush as they fall to the ground, and I feel his half-hardness against me. I beg him, no teasing, and he obliges. I moan and push back, and we rut in that clearing, groans of my pleasure and groans of his good fortune mingling and dissipating into the night. We are learning, he and I. There are 2 rules. He cannot finish inside of me, and he cannot touch my green ribbon. He spends into the dirt, patting like the beginning of rain. I go to touch myself, but my fingers, which have been curling in the dirt beneath me, are filthy. I pull up my underwear and stockings. He makes a sound and points. I realize that beneath the nylon, my knees are also caked in dirt. I pull my stockings down and brush and then up again. I smooth my skirt and repin my hair. A single lock has escaped his slick-back curls in his exertion, and I tuck it up with the others. We walk down to the stream, and I run my hands in their current until they are clean again. We stroll back into the house, arms linked chastely. Inside, my mother has made coffee, and we all sit around while my father asks him about business. If you read this story out loud, the sounds of the clearing can be best reproduced by taking a deep breath and holding it for a long moment. Then release the air all at once, permitting your chest to collapse like a block tower knocked to the ground. Do this again and again, shortening the time between the held breath and the release. I have always been a teller of stories. When I was a young girl, my mother carried me out of a grocery store as I screamed about toes in the produce aisle. Concerned women turned and watched as I kicked the air and pounded my mother's slender back. Potatoes, she corrected as we got back to the house, not toes. She told me to sit in my chair, a child-sized thing built just for me, until my father returned. But no, I had seen the toes, pale and bloody stumps, mixed in amongst the russet tubers. One of them, the one that I had poked the tip of my index finger, was cold as ice and yielded beneath my touch the way a blister did. When I repeated this detail to my mother, something behind the liquid of her eyes shifted quick as a startled cat. "You stay right there," she said. My father returned from work that evening and listened to my story, each detail. "You've met Mr. Barnes, have you not?" he asked me, referring to the elderly man who ran this particular market. I had met him once, and I said so. He had hair white as sky before snow and a wife who drew the signs for the store windows. "Why would Mr. Barnes sell toes?" my father asked. "Where would he get them?" Being young and having no understanding of graveyards or mortuaries, I could not answer. "And even if he got them somewhere," my father continued, "what would he have to gain by selling them amongst the potatoes?" They had been there. I had seen them with my own eyes, but beneath the sunbeam of my father's logic, I felt my doubt unfurl. Most importantly, my father said, arriving triumphantly at his final piece of evidence, "Why did no one notice the toes except for you?" As a grown woman, I would have said to my father that there are true things in this world observed by a single set of eyes. As a girl, I consented to his account of the story and laughed when he scooped me from the chair to kiss me and send me on my way. It is not normal that a girl teaches her boy, but I am only showing him what I want, what plays on the inside of my eyelids as I fall asleep. He comes to know the flicker of expression as desire passes through me, and I hold nothing back from him. When he tells me that he wants my mouth, the length of my throat, I teach myself not to gag and take him all into me, moaning around the saltiness. When he asks me my worst secret, I tell him about the teacher who hid me in the closet until the others were gone and made me hold him there, and how afterward I went home and scrubbed my hands with a steel wool pad until they bled, even though the memories strike such a chord of anger and shame in me that after I shared this I have nightmares for a month. When he asked me to marry him, days shy of my 18th birthday, I say yes, yes, please, and then on that park bench I sit on his lap and fan my skirt around us so that a passerby would not know what was happening beneath it. "I feel like I know so many parts of you," he says to me, knuckle deep and trying not to pant, "and now I will know all of them." There is a story they tell about a girl dared by her peers to venture to a local graveyard after dark. This was her folly. When they told her that standing on someone's grave at night would cause the inhabitant to reach up and pull her under, she scoffed. Scoffing is the first mistake a woman can make. "Life is too short to be afraid of nothing," she said, "and I will show you." Pride is the second mistake. She could do it, she insisted, because no such fate would befall her. So they gave her a knife to stick into the frosty earth as a way of proving her presence and her theory. She went to that graveyard. Some storytellers say that she picked the grave at random. I believe she selected a very old one, her choice tinged by self-doubt and the latent belief that if she were wrong, the intact muscle and flesh of a newly dead corpse would be more dangerous than 1 centuries gone. She knelt on the grave and plunged the blade deep. As she stood to run, for there was no one to see her fear, she found she couldn't escape. Something was clutching her clothes. She cried out and fell to the ground. When morning came, her friends arrived at the cemetery. They found her dead on the grave, the blade pinning the sturdy wool of her skirt to the earth. Dead of fright or exposure, would it matter when the parents arrived? She was not wrong, but it didn't matter anymore. Afterward, everyone believed that she had wished to die, even though she had died proving that she wanted to live. As it turns out, being right is the third and worst mistake. My parents are pleased about the marriage. My mother says that even though girls nowadays are trying to marry late, she married my father when she was 19, and she was glad she did. When I select my wedding gown, I'm reminded of the story of the young woman who wished to go to a dance with her lover, but could not afford a dress. She purchased a lovely white frock from a second-hand shop and then later fell ill and passed from this earth. A doctor who examined her in her final days discovered that she had died from exposure to embalming fluid. It turned out that an unscrupulous undertaker's assistant had stolen the dress from the corpse of a bride. The moral of that story, I think, is that being poor will kill you. I spend more on my dress than I intend, but it is very beautiful and better than being dead. When I fold it into my hope chest, I think about the bride who played hide-and-go-seek on her wedding day and hid in the attic in an old trunk that snapped shut around her and did not open. She was trapped there until she died. People thought that she had run away until years later when a maid found her skeleton in a white dress folded inside that dark space. Brides never fare well in stories. Stories can sense happiness and snuff it out like a candle. We marry in April on an unseasonably cold afternoon. He sees me before the wedding in my dress and insists on kissing me deeply before reaching inside my bodice. He becomes hard, and I tell him that I want him to use my body as he sees fit. I rescind my first rule, given the occasion. He pushes me against the wall and puts his hand against the tile near my throat to steady himself. His thumb brushes my ribbon. He does not move his hand, and as he works himself in me, he says, "I love you, I love you, I love you." I do not know if I'm the first woman to walk up the aisle of St. George's with semen leaking down her leg, but I like to imagine that I am. For our honeymoon, we go on a tour of Europe. We are not rich, but we make it work. Europe is a continent of stories, and in between consummations, I learn them. We go from bustling ancient metropolises to sleepy villages to alpine retreats and back again, sipping spirits and pulling roasted meat from bones with our teeth, eating spätzle and olives and ravioli and a creamy grain I do not recognize but come to crave each morning. We cannot afford a sleeper car on the train, but my husband bribes an attendant to permit us 1 hour in an empty room, and in that way we couple over the Rhine, my husband pinning me to the rickety frame and howling like something more primordial than the mountains we cross. I recognize this is not the entire world, but it is the first part of it that I am seeing, and I am electrified by possibility. If you are reading this story out loud, make the sound of the bed under the tension of train travel and lovemaking by straining a metal folding chair against its hinges. When you are exhausted with that, sing the half-remembered lyrics of old songs to the person closest to you, thinking of lullabies for children. My cycle stops soon after we return from our trip. I tell my husband one night, and after we are spent and sprawled across our bed, he glows with real delight. "A child," he says. He lies back with his hands beneath his head. A child. He is quiet for so long that I think he's fallen asleep, but when I look over, his eyes are open and fixed on the ceiling. He rolls on his side and gazes at me. Will the child have a ribbon? I feel my jaw tighten, and my hand fondles my bow involuntarily. My mind skips between many answers, and I settle on the one that brings me the least amount of anger. "There's no saying now," I tell him finally. He startles me then by rubbing his hand around my throat. I put up one of my hands to stop him, but he uses his strength, grabbing my wrist with one hand as he touches the ribbon with the other. He presses the silky length with his thumb. He touches the bow delicately, as if he is massaging my sex. "Please," I say, "please don't." He does not seem to hear. "Please," I say again, my voice louder, but cracking in the middle. He could have done it then, untied the bow if he'd chosen to. But he releases me and rolls onto my back as if nothing has happened. My wrists ache, and I rub them. "I need a glass of water," I say. I get up to go to the bathroom. I run the tap and then frantically check my ribbon, tears caught in my lashes. The bow is still tight. There is a story I love about a pioneer husband and wife killed by wolves. Neighbors found their bodies torn open and strewn around the tiny cabin, but never located their infant daughter, alive or dead. People claim they saw the girl running with a wolf pack, loping over the terrain as wild and feral as any of her companions. News of her would ripple through the local settlements upon each sighting. She menaced a hunter in a winter forest, though perhaps he was less menaced than startled at a tiny naked girl baring her teeth and howling so rawly it quaked the skin on his bones. A young woman on the cusp of marriage age trying to take down a horse. People even saw her ripping open a chicken in an explosion of feathers. Many years later, she was said to be resting in the rushes along a riverbank, suckling 2 wolf cubs. I like to imagine that they came from her body, the lineage of wolves tainted human just the once. They certainly bloodied her breasts, but she did not mind, because they were hers and only hers. I believe that when their muzzles and teeth pressed against her, she felt a kind of sanctuary, peace she would have found nowhere else. She must have been better among them than she would have been otherwise. Of that I am certain. Months pass and my stomach swells. Inside of me our child is swimming fiercely, kicking and pushing and clawing. In public I gasp and stagger to the side, clutching my belly and hissing through my teeth to little one, as I call it, to stop. Once I stumble on a walk in the park, the same park where my husband had proposed to me the year before, and go to my knees, breathing heavily and near weeping. A woman passing by helps me sit up and gives me some water, telling me that the first pregnancy is always the worst, but they get better with time. It is the worst, but for so many reasons besides my altered form. I sing to my child and think about the old wives' tale of carrying the baby high or low. Do I carry a boy inside of me, the image of his father? Or a girl, a daughter who would soften the sons that followed? I had no siblings, but I know that eldest girls sweeten their brothers and are protected by them from the dangers of the world, an arrangement that buoys my heart. My body changes in ways I do not expect. My breasts are large and hot, and my stomach lined with pale marks, the inverse of a tiger's. I feel monstrous, but my husband seems renewed with desire, as if my novel shape has refreshed our list of perversities. And my body responds. In line at the supermarket, receiving communion in church, I am marked by a new and ferocious want, leaving me slippery and swollen at the slightest provocation. When he comes home each day, my husband has made a list in his mind of the things he desires from me, and I am willing to provide them and more, having been on the edge of coming since the morning's purchase of bread and carrots. I am the luckiest man alive, he says, running his hands across my stomach. In the mornings, he kisses me and fondles me and sometimes takes me before coffee and toast. He goes to work with a spring in his step. He comes home with one promotion and then another. More money for my family, he says, more money for our happiness. Of all the stories I know about mothers, this one is the most real. A young American girl is visiting Paris with her mother when the woman begins to feel ill. They decide to check into a hotel for a few days so the mother can rest, and the daughter calls for a doctor to assess her. After a brief examination, the doctor tells the daughter that all the mother needs is some medicine. He takes the daughter to a taxi, gives the driver instructions in French, and explains to the girl the driver will take her to his residence, where his wife will give her the appropriate remedy. They drive and drive for a very long time, and when the girl arrives, she is frustrated by the unbearable slowness of the doctor's wife, who meticulously assembles the pills from powder. When she gets back into the taxi, the driver meanders down the streets, sometimes doubling back on the same avenue. Frustrated, the girl gets out of the taxi to return to the hotel on foot. When she finally arrives, the hotel clerk tells her he has never seen her before. When she runs to the room where her mother had been resting, she finds the walls a different color, the furnishings different than her memory, and her mother nowhere in sight. There are many endings to the story. In one of them, the girl is gloriously persistent and certain, renting a room nearby and staking out the hotel, eventually seducing a young man who works in the laundry and discovering the truth, that her mother had died of a highly contagious and fatal disease, departing this plane shortly after the daughter was sent from the hotel by the doctor. To avoid a citywide panic, the staff removed and buried her body, repainted and refurnished the room, and bribed all involved to deny that they had ever met the pair. In another version of the story, the girl wanders the streets of Paris for years, believing she is mad, that she invented her mother and her life with her mother in her own diseased mind. The daughter stumbles from hotel to hotel, confused and grieving, though for whom she cannot say. Each time she's ejected from another posh lobby, she weeps for something lost. Her mother is dead, and she does not know it. She won't know it until she, herself, is also dead, assuming you believe in paradise. I don't need to tell you the moral of this story. I think you already know what it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. It's kind of wonderful. Carmen and my books are both published today. I've been dying to read hers, but unable to get it. So I'm going to be first in line to get that book. And I thought I would just talk for a couple of minutes about my book, which has been a very long time in the making. I became interested in New York during World War II as just sort of an atmosphere I wanted to explore, and I'm still not exactly sure why. So back in 2004 at the New York Public Library, I started looking at images of New York during the war. And what struck me immediately was just the omnipresence of the waterfront. Now, by that time, I had lived in New York for 15 years or so, and really barely thought about the waterfront except as a nice place to go running. And I loved looking at the dilapidated piers. And so, but what I realized, I guess I already knew it, was that the time that I was interested in writing about was a time when the waterfront was the locus of really all activity. It was where transportation happened. It was the way goods moved and people moved. And in photographs of the city at that time, it was just so clear that everything kind of inclined out toward the water. So I pursued my curiosity about that, and it led me into many directions. It led me to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is a remarkable sort of hidden place that was only blocks from where I lived, and which was the largest builder and repairer of Allied ships during World War II. It repaired some 5,000 of them and built 17 battleships. And about 5,000 women worked there at the height of the war, which was not actually very many when you consider that there were about 70,000 employees total, but they were doing all kinds of jobs that they would never have been allowed to do before. I got very interested in deep sea diving. I learned that civilian divers help to repair ships from the outside. I then found myself bewitched by the merchant marine, to my own amazement, and interested in liberty ships and torpedoes and all of that. And also, it was impossible to think about or to research the New York waterfront without stumbling upon organized crime. And gangsters and a sort of machine control of this all-important waterfront, and lots of rivalries and bad behavior among the various mobsters who worked there. So meanwhile, during these years, I had 2 kids. I was writing other books. I published The Keep, and then I published Goon Squad. And meanwhile, I was also doing things like going to a reunion of veteran Army divers and trying on a 200-pound Mark V diving suit. So it was sort of my secret life. I didn't actually write anything about this stuff, but I researched it. And I reached a point where I was on the board of a new museum that was being built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I was engaged in an oral history project, interviewing people who had worked at the Navy Yard. And at some point I thought, am I actually going to write a book about this? Or is this just something I like to do? And I came to feel that it really didn't matter, and that in fact, if nothing came of it except that I was enriched by all that I had learned and the remarkable people I had met, many of them already passed on because they were in their 80s in the first decade of the 21st century, that if that's all that happened, it would be worth it, certainly to me, and that I would even have made some small contribution to the larger pool of knowledge by collaborating on this oral history and certain other things. So it was really it almost feels like an amazing afterthought, although it was a very hard afterthought to complete, that I actually have finished this book. And I'm so pleased to actually have had the pleasure of the research and then also to finish the book. So I'm going to just read part of chapter 5, which is the beginning of the second part of the book, and the second part is called Shadow World. It all started with seeing the girl. Anna had gone outside to buy lunch over the disapproval of her supervisor, Mr. Voss, who liked them to bring their lunches from home and eat them on the same tall stools where they sat measuring all day. Anna sensed anxiety in his wish to keep them in sight, as if girls at large at the Naval Yard might scatter like chickens. True, their shop was pleasant to eat in, clean and brightly lit by a bank of second-story windows. It had conditioned air, a humming chill that filled every corner during the hot September days when Anna first came to work there. Now she would have liked to open a window and let in the fresh October air, but the windows were permanently shut, sealing out dust and grime that might affect the measurements she and the other girls took. Or was it that the tiny parts they were measuring needed to be pristine in order to function? No one knew. And Mr. Voss was not a man who welcomed questions. Early on, Anne had asked of the unrecognizable parts in her tray, "What are we measuring exactly, and which ship are they for?" Mr. Voss's pale eyebrows rose. "That information isn't necessary to do your job, Miss Kerrigan." "It would help me to do it better." "I'm afraid I don't follow." "I would know what I was doing." The marrieds hid their smiles. Anna had been cast, or cast herself, in the role of unruly kid sister and was enjoying it immensely. She found herself looking for little ways to challenge Mr. Voss without risking outright insubordination. "You are measuring and it's inspecting parts to ensure that they are uniform," he said patiently, as if to a half-wit, "and you are setting aside any that are not." Soon it came to be known that the parts they were inspecting were for the battleship Missouri, whose keel had been laid almost a year before Pearl Harbor in Dry Dock 4. Later, the Missouri's hull had been floated across Wallabout Bay to the building ways, vast iron enclosures whose zigzagging catwalks evoked the Coney Island cyclone. Knowing that the parts she was inspecting would be adjoined to the most modern battleship ever built had indeed brought some additional zest to the work for Anna, but not enough. When the lunch whistle blew at 11:30, she was itching to get outside. In order to justify leaving the building, she didn't bring a lunch, a ploy that she knew did not fool Mr. Voss. But he couldn't very well deny a girl food, so he watched grimly as she made for the door while the marrieds unwrapped their sandwiches from waxed paper and talked about husbands in boot camp or overseas who'd had a letter, clues or hunches or dreams as to where their beloveds might be. How desperately frightened they were. More than one girl had wept, describing her terror that a husband or fiancé would not return. Anna couldn't listen. Their talk stirred in her an uncomfortable anger at these girls who seemed so weak. Thankfully, Mr. Voss had put an end to that topic during working hours, prompting an unlikely trill of gratitude in Anna. Now they sang songs from their colleges while they worked, Hunter, St. Joseph's, Brooklyn College, whose song Anna finally learned, not having bothered to in the year she was a student there. She synchronized her wristwatch with the large wall clock they all answered to and stepped outdoors. After the sealed hush of her shop, the roar of yard noise always shocked her. Crane and truck and train engines, the caterwaul of steel being cut and chipped in the nearby structural shop, men hollering to be heard. The stench of coal and oil mingled with gusts of chocolate from the factory on Flushing Avenue. It wasn't making chocolate anymore, but something for soldiers to eat when they might otherwise starve. This chocolate cousin was supposed to taste like a boiled potato, Anna had heard, so that soldiers wouldn't be tempted to snack on it ahead of time. But the smell was still delicious. As she hurried alongside Building 4, the structural shop with its 1,000 dingy windows, she saw a girl climbing onto a bicycle. Anna didn't register at first that it was a girl. She wore the same plain blue work clothes they all did. But something in her bearing, the flair with which she mounted, caught Anna's eye, and she watched the girl glide away with a shiver of envy. At a canteen near the piers, they bought 40-cent. At a canteen near the piers, she bought her 40-cent boxed meal. Today it was chicken, mashed potatoes, canned peas, and applesauce, and made her way toward piers C and D, both close enough to her shop that she could eat, often while standing, even walking, and be back on her stool by 12:15. A ship had berthed at Pier C since the previous day, its sudden towering apparition almost otherworldly. With each step Anna took toward the ship, its height seemed to rise until she had to tip her head fully back to follow the curved prow all the way up to the distant deck. It was thronged with sailors, identical looking in their toy-like uniforms and caps, all leaning over the rail to gawk at something below. In that same moment, a chorus of catcalls reached her. She went still, clutching her boxed lunch, then saw, with relief, that the object of their ardor was not her, but the girl on the bicycle, who was riding back alongside the ship from the foot of the pier, a tussle of peroxide curls pried from her scarf by the wind. Anna watched her approach, trying to discern whether the girl was enjoying this attention or not. Before she could make up her mind, the bicycle hit a patch of gravel and skidded on its side, dumping its rider onto the brick-paved pier, to the jeering hilarity of the sailors. Had the men been within reach of the girl, they doubtless would have elbowed each other aside to rush to her aid. But at such a height, with only each other to show off for, they settled for an orgy of heckling. "Aw, poor baby lost her balance. Shame she's not wearing a skirt. Say, you're pretty even when you're crying." But the girl wasn't crying. She stood up angrily, humiliated but defiant, and Anna decided then that she liked her. She'd thought fleetingly of running to help the girl, but was glad she'd resisted. Two girls struggling with a bicycle would be funnier than just one. And this girl would not have wanted help. She straightened her shoulders and walked the bicycle slowly to the top of the pier where Anna was, giving no sign that she heard anything. Anna saw how pretty she was, with dimpled cheeks and flickering blue eyes, those Jean Harlow curls. Familiar, too, perhaps because she looked the way Lydia might have looked had she not been the way she was, Lydia's Anna's sister. The world was full of strangers, Betty Grable among them, for whom Anna felt a sisterly affection for that reason. But as the girl stalked past, ignoring Anna, she recognized her as one of the girls whom reporters had chosen to follow in September on the first day girls had started working at the Naval Yard. Anna had seen her picture in the Brooklyn Eagle. When she was safely past the ship, the girl mounted her bicycle and rode away. Anna checked her wristwatch and discovered with horror that she was almost 13 minutes late. She sprinted toward her building, aware of creating a mild spectacle by running. She flew past the inspectors on the first floor, all men using ladders to measure bigger parts, and resumed her stool at 12:37, sweat coursing from her armpits along the inside of her jumpsuit. She fixed her eyes on the tray of small parts she was given each day to measure and tried to quell her panting. Rose, a maid she was friendly with, gave her a warning look from the next table. The micrometer was stupidly easy to use. Clasp, screw, read. Anna had been delighted with this assignment at first. Girls in trades like welding and riveting had needed 6 weeks of instruction, whereas inspecting required just a week of aptitude tests. She was among college girls, said Mr. Voss, and Mr. Voss had used the word elite in his introductory remarks, which had pleased her. Above all, she was tired of working with her hands. But after 2 days of reading the micrometer and then stamping a paper that came with her tray to certify that the parts were uniform, Anna found that she loathed the job. It was monotonous, yet required concentration, numbingly mundane, yet critical enough that it took place in a clean room. Squinting at the micrometer made her head pound. She had an urge sometimes to try and use just her fingers to gauge whether the parts were correctly sized, but she could only guess, then had to measure to find out if her guess was correct. And the all-knowing Mr. Voss had spotted her working with her eyes closed. "May I ask what you're doing, Miss Kerrigan?" he'd remarked. When Anna told him, for the amusement of the marrieds, he'd said, "This is no time for whimsy. We've a war to fight." Now, when the shift was done and they were back in street clothes, Mr. Voss asked Anna to step inside his office. No one had ever been called into his office. This was ominous. "Shall I wait?" Rose asked as the other marrieds wished her luck and hurried away. But Anna demurred, knowing that Rose had a baby to get home to. The snapper's office was bare and provisional, like most of the Navy Yard. After standing briefly when she entered, Mr. Voss resumed his seat behind a metal desk. You were 20 minutes late returning from lunch, he said. 22, in fact. Anna stood before him, her heart pumping directly into her face. Mr. Voss was an important man in the yard. The commandant had telephoned him more than once. He could have her dismissed. This was a prospect she hadn't fully considered in the weeks she'd spent gently galling him. But it struck her now with force. She had withdrawn from Brooklyn College. If she weren't here at work, she would be back at home with her mother, caring for Lydia. "I'm sorry," she said. "It won't happen again." "Have a seat," he said, and Anna lowered herself onto a chair. "If you've not had much experience in the working world, these rules and restrictions must seem like quite a bother." "I've worked all my life," she said, but it sounded hollow. She was full of shame, as if she'd glimpsed her own reflection in a shop window and found it ridiculous. A college girl craving a taste of war work, an elite. That was how he must see her. Slogans from the ship worker drifted through her mind. Minutes saved here mean lives saved there. When you don't work, you work for the enemy. "You're aware that we may not win the war," he said. She blinked. "Why, yes, of course." Newspapers weren't allowed inside the Navy Yard for fear of damaging morale, but Anna bought a Times each evening outside the Sand Street gate. "You realize that the Nazis have Stalingrad surrounded?" She nodded, head bowed in humiliation. "And that the Japs control the Pacific Theater from the Philippines to New Guinea?" "Yes." "You understand that the work we do here, building and repairing Allied ships, is what allows sailors, airplanes, bombs, and convoy escorts to reach the field of battle?" A filament of annoyance waggled inside her. He'd made his point. "Yes." "And that hundreds of Allied merchantmen have been torpedoed since the war began, with more going down each day?" "We're losing fewer ships than before and building more," she said. Quietly, having read this in the Times just recently. "Kaiser Shipyard built a Liberty in 10 days last month." It sounded egregiously fresh, and Anna waited for the blow to fall. But Mr. Voss merely said after a pause, "I noticed you don't bring a lunch. I presume you live at home?" "Yes, I do," Anna said. "But my mother and I are awfully busy caring for my sister. She's badly crippled." This was true, but also untrue. Her mother made breakfast and dinner for Anna. She could easily have packed a lunch and had offered to. Anna had slipped into the unguarded manner she often found herself assuming with strangers or virtual strangers. Her reward was a faint disturbance of surprise in Mr. Voss's face. "Now that's a shame," he said. "Can't your father help?" "He's gone." She almost never revealed this fact and hadn't planned to. "In the service?" He looked dubious. Surely a man with a 19-year-old daughter would be too old. "Just gone." "He abandoned your family?" 5 years ago. Had Anna felt any emotion at this disclosure, she would have concealed it, but she did not. Her father had left the apartment as he would have on any day. She couldn't even recall it. The truth had arrived gradually, like nightfall. A recognition when she caught herself awaiting his return that she'd waited days, then weeks, then months, and he'd still not come. She was 14, then 15. Hope became the memory of hope, a numb, dead patch. She no longer could picture him clearly. Mr. Voss took a long breath. "Well, that is difficult," he said, "very difficult for you and your mother." "And my sister," she said reflexively. The silence that opened around them was uncomfortable, but not unpleasant. It was a change. Mr. Voss's shirt sleeves were rolled. She noticed the blonde hairs on his hands and strong rectangular wrists. Anna sensed his sympathy, but the tight aperture of their discourse afforded no channel through which sentiment might flow. And sympathy was not what she wanted. She wanted to go out at lunchtime. The bustle of the shift change had settled. The night inspectors must be at work on their trays. Anna found herself recalling the girl on the bicycle, Nell. The name came to her suddenly from the newspaper caption. "Miss Kerrigan," Mr. Voss said at last, "you may go out for lunch if you will carefully mind the time and work to your full capacity." "Thank you," Anna cried, leaping to her feet. Mr. Voss looked startled, then stood as well. He smiled, something she hadn't seen before. It changed him, that smile, as if all the severity he displayed on the inspection floor were a hiding place from which this amiable man had just waved hello. Only his voice was the same. "I expect your mother will be needing you at home," he said. "Good evening." Thank you.
Why was Manhattan Beach so hard, and what parts of that? Can you talk about that?
Sure. The question is, why was Manhattan Beach so hard? I think what made it hard was particularly the way that I write, which is, in my first drafts, very intuitive and with no plan. I don't usually have a plot, and I don't even have characters. So that has worked for me by sort of starting with a sense of atmosphere, a time and place, and then just kind of running with that and seeing what I come up with, and then embarking on a long process of editing it into something that feels readable. But because this book involved so many areas of specific knowledge about which I had no knowledge, it was difficult to do anything. I mean, it was difficult to even bluff my way through a first draft, but it was also very difficult to know what I needed to research because I didn't have a plot or characters. So I felt sort of frozen. And so what I did, the way I got around that was that I would get enough knowledge about a particular environment to sort of hack my way through something. And then I would, keep going, and there were some characters and a plot forming, but I was dogged throughout by a very legitimate feeling that what I was writing was quite atrocious. And so that was a difficult experience. It was just not a nice working environment to have someone in my head telling me this is terrible the entire time. So I think I was really undermining my own process, but there was no other way. And then once I finally, continued with this dialectic between researching and writing, and then more researching, and I was really doing both at once, I did finally reach a point where I felt comfortable. I felt like I could move around, and that was when it became fun. But that took quite a while.
I'll just a question then for both of you, because we do have the honor of hosting you on your publication day, and I wonder if you would each talk a little bit about what does that feel like to you after having spent so much time by yourselves with these books. What does publication day feel like, and what does it feel like to meet your readers?
You start.
Well, I mean, it's my first book, so that's just sort of terrifying. And it's funny, like I've been writing short fiction and essays for so long, and even when I've published them in magazines, like there was still this sense of pliability. Like I can always like take it back and like add things and fix things. And in fact, like the versions of my stories in the book are slightly different than the versions that were published for the ones that were actually published. But now it's like been fully taken away from me. I can't do anything to it. If anyone tells me like I don't like this thing, it's like, well, it exists. It's in the world. I can't do anything about it. So it's terrifying in a way to like let that go, especially after spending like years and years working on it. But also there's something very freeing about it, because I feel like readers can do things for the book that I can't do for it. Like they can say to me like, I read this into it, and like it spoke to me in this way, and like that's very magical, and like I can't create that. Like that's just an organic part of the process. So it feels like really, I mean, it's incredible, and it feels also very terrifying but freeing. And I feel like the book can now sort of continue to grow away from me. I suppose somewhat like a child, I imagine. They get to like live their own lives now,
Yeah, I mean, I feel some of that too. I feel a strong sense of disbelief. I think in the particular case of this book, it just felt like the distance between what I was doing for such a long time and anything that really would have been publishable felt so great that it just seemed like a pipe dream that I would ever be sitting on a stage holding a book called Manhattan Beach. It was like a crazy fantasy. And what I'm remembering now, having published other books, is that there's a strange thing that happens when you start to talk about the book, which is that you find a way to talk about it, and learn some things about what it's about from readers, and that is really a joy. I mean, really, I had no idea what Goon Squad was until I started talking to audiences, and they filled me in. It was great. But all of that kind of talking and storytelling, which is such a delight and so much easier than writing in certain ways, in a way kind of covers up the chaos and in my case with this book, really a kind of terror that I had about what would happen. And I can feel that just dissipating. It's like a nightmare that hangs over you and then it's gone and you think, well, I don't even remember that bad part of the dream. So I'm right in that moment now where I can feel the dissipating happening and I welcome it. But at the same time, I realize that solitude that I had with the book is being replaced by a communal experience with readers, which I enjoy very much.
Jennifer, could you give us some idea of the research that you did? I imagine you buried in libraries and at the Library of Congress. Was there any of that? Can you give us some stories about that?
Well, I think I approached it very journalistically because this really is a period that exists in living memory. So that was really, so basically there was a mix of reading and yes, Library of Congress and National Archives in Lower Manhattan and, actual very bookish, finding of arcane texts about deep sea diving that really would probably not be of interest to too many people. Reading merchant marine handbooks, at the gym. I really reached a point where I was so excited by all of this that I couldn't get enough of it. But I feel people looking at me like, whoa, it's amazing what some people find fun to exercise too. There was one called How to Abandon Ship, which also got me some quizzical glances. I think that the most exciting part was certainly interacting with the people, though, and availing myself of their remarkable memories. And one gentleman in particular who was a merchant marine officer during World War II on Liberty ships and now volunteers at the Jeremiah O'Brien, which is a functional Liberty ship, the last one, that actually goes on short cruises. I went on one. And this guy was amazing. He spent 3 hours with me. We walked all over the ship. He's like 6'4". And he was 93 then. He's now 95 and bitter about the fact that he's not allowed to drive at night anymore. But he was still driving at night then. And it was just, there was something so rich and intense about the feeling that I was intersecting with these people, but I didn't know whether I would be able to ever have that experience again with them or how much longer they would be here. So there was a rich, fleeting quality to it. And in fact, one gentleman I met who was a World War II Army diver who worked in the harbor of Cherbourg, clearing out debris that the Germans left, was spry and full of great stories. And he told me that he had met a female Russian diver. And I was interested in hearing more about that encounter. And so we had a sort of a plan to talk on the phone, in the next few weeks, and he very abruptly passed away, and we never got to have that conversation. So it felt very much like grabbing at precious shards as they were passing out of my grasp, and so it was really very meaningful.
Jennifer, this book sounds very different from Goon Squad, not just in the content, but in the narrative form, and almost seems like it's two different writers. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little, if you agree with that.
I agree. I think it would be difficult to find a book more unlike Goon Squad than this one. I am sure that will not please every reader of Goon Squad. It may displease many, and I feel badly about that. But it is normal for me to do that. I really do, with each book, try to almost renounce everything I've done in the previous book. Not forever, but for that moment. And I'd be curious to know what you think about this, because within Goon Squad, when you're working on stories, you can sort of do that every time in a certain way. But working on a book as long as one does, there's something for me that's kind of exciting about just saying, now you can't use any of those tools, but you have to build this thing. You have to build another thing like that, but you can't use any of the same tools at all. It's so bracing. And at first it's always very messy because all I have is those tools. So I try to use them and it's terrible. With this one I tried all kinds of structural trickiness that I'd gotten very reliant on in Goon Squad, and it was dead on arrival. And it was amazing how poorly it worked. And I kept thinking, but I've been told that I do this well. But it was so bad. I would bring it into my writing group and they'd say, don't do that. It was the kind of not working narrative that makes the reader angry at the writer. So I had to let all of that go. And once I finally did, it was such a pleasure to be in a new world.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually why I like short stories, because I like to be able to indulge that. So you're more disciplined. Like, so I'm just like, oh, I'll write a story with a weird form and then I'll like end it and then I can just put it aside and I can try something new. And I like sort of flitting from like idea to idea and topic to topic and genre to genre. And I feel like if I had to do a full novel, I would just go nuts. I don't think I'd be able to do it.
Well, I think in a way the challenge is always within whatever structural or craft choices you've made to find, at least what I'm always thinking is, how can I find the maximal variety and how can I also break all the rules that I'm making? I mean, that's a kind of basic thing that I think, for me, that kind of has to happen. And how can it be opposite things at the same time and yet not overlap with what I've done before? So hopefully that keeps it interesting and keeps it from getting sort of, overwhelmingly the same. But it is true. It was, for me, a huge change to go from a book written in basically fragments to one that had big demands about momentum and, plot resolution. And I realized something, which is that Goon Squad doesn't have a ton of drama. A lot of the action happens off stage, and we don't see it. And I realized that it was so fun to write kind of an old-fashioned adventure story. Like things just happen. Like people go to sea, they get killed. And I'm not giving anything away there. That's just the world that it's taking place in, and that was such a refreshing change from what I had gotten very used to. How does it feel to win the Pulitzer Prize? Very lucky. It is very lucky to win any prize. It is almost pure luck, because the way you win a prize is that you delight the right combination of people at the right time. There's no mystery about how it happens. I mean, I've judged prizes myself, and you probably have too. There are always close calls, and I think one of the painful things sometimes is, as a judge, knowing which ones those were, and as a winner, knowing that it could easily have been someone else, and they would have had all of those benefits. So it feels very lucky.
I have a question for Carmen. So you said that now that the stories they're no longer yours to rewrite, but do you feel like you, as a short story writer or an essayist, ever actually finish writing a story, or are they always something that can always be rewritten over and over again? Or is there ever a point where they're just done?
That's a really good question. I feel as if there's not necessarily, like, I think I usually have a sense of a piece of work being done, but if you don't take something away from me, like, I could theoretically rewrite it into like a little nub, like I feel like it's like a pencil that you just keep writing with, and eventually it's like this big, or you keep sharpening it and then eventually like you can't use it anymore. So I feel like I could do that if someone wasn't like, nope, I need to, I need that, we're putting it somewhere, or it's going in the book, like, stop. So yeah, but I do get a sense of when I'm writing, and it's hard to explain. Like, people ask me, like, when do I know a story is done? Like, it's a really hard process, or not hard. It's intuitive. Like, it's hard to explain. So I feel like as a writer, like in the beginning, I didn't know when stories were done, and I would just sort of keep writing them and be like, I don't know. But then I feel like I've sort of developed intuition where there's a sense of emotional finality for me, where I'm like, I feel like I've sated something inside of myself, and I'm like, this feels correct. But I'm a real, like, I'll keep fiddling with the sentences. Like, even reading up on that podium, I was like, I could have moved that sentence around. Like, there was a couple of word choices that I had where I was like, I don't, but I can't do anything about it. Like, the book is out of my hands. So I feel like it's definitely possible to kind of polish something into oblivion. And so I have to kind of avoid that instinct and just know when to kind of be like, okay, like, I feel like it's done. It's got to, like, go away from me now. Or an editor's got to look at it who is smarter than me and knows like, what to do with it next.
After working so long on a project, is it hard to move on to your next book? Is there a grief? Does inspiration just rush in? What is that process like to move on to your next project?
Do you want to talk about that? You have a new book coming out soon.
I do. Yeah. I sold a second book to Grey Wolf. I mean, it's funny because I feel like when I was writing Her Body and Other Parties, I kept thinking, well, what's going to happen when this book is done and I have no more ideas? Because I feel like this is like me scraping the bottom of the bowl of my own ideas. What will I do then? And that's a really terrifying feeling, right? Like I'll have a book published, at least one, hopefully. But I feel like what's funny is like as I kept reading and writing and playing around, I discovered, and I should also add that like having a collection is hard because like I can sort of keep adding to it. So I'd be like, oh, this story that I wrote goes in the collection, or this story. But then at some point I could actually feel like the center of my attention was shifting to a different idea. Because like my book is about bodies and the oppressed body and the queer body and women's bodies and sex and sexuality. And at some point, the stories that I was writing were not about those things anymore. Like I have work that I've published since then that like, even if I could have put it in the book, I wouldn't have because it didn't really fit with that idea. So, and it turns out I have more ideas. Like, turns out that well like refills if you keep like reading and keep, doing what you're doing, living your life. So it is actually exciting to feel like there are other books in me, which I didn't know before that would be the case. But yeah, I feel like I just really, I feel good, and I feel like, not only is there another book, there's like several, like I can feel like various projects that are sort of going in various directions, and that's really exciting.
I feel of two minds. I mean, I think there's, it became such a wonderful escape for me, this book, being in a different world, I think particularly, or being a different moment, I should say, being released from my quasi-obsession with technology, was just very freeing. I mean, it's not that there was no technology at that time, but a lot of there were really very few screens. And so that was really wonderful. It was great during the election to not have to contend with contemporary life. I mean, I really don't know what I would have done. How do you, well, yes, so I think we all get it. So that was a wonderful escape, and I felt the sort of like brooding, noirish atmosphere that I felt I was in when I was working on this was really a place I wanted to be. And even in the spring when I was done with the book and I was going through page proofs, my husband kept saying, "Why are you still reading these cheesy old mysteries? You're done." And I thought, but I don't want it to really be over. All of that said, I feel as you do that in a certain way, I'm also, I have resolved a certain set of interests here that make me eager to do very different things. And my hope to have something happen next that is as different from this as this was from Goon Squad. So it's wistful, but also healthy. I guess change is always healthy for me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Carmen Maria Machado and Jennifer Egan.